Hey guys, it's Shara from Woodshop Diaries, and in this video, we're gonna be building a mid-century modern Lowboy console. I am super pumped about this project, so let's dive in and get building. Okay, so for this project, we're doing things a little bit different. Typically, you'll see me work with maple and birch plywood, but this time I'm gonna be working with walnut plywood. Purebond Plywood sent me this Euro ply. It's got a lot more plies than their standard like birch and maple plywood that I'm used to using. This is actually intended to be left like exposed. So you can apply edge banding, but I'm not going to apply edge banding. It's kind of designed to be a feature in your project. We're gonna be using this to build with, so first things first, let's cut it down. So for this project, I'm using this walnut plywood, and these panels come in 2 foot by 8 foot sheets instead of your typical 4 by 8 sheets. I built everything for this project from plywood except for the legs. So first, I began cutting my plywood to the sizes I needed. Like usual, I ripped the plywood down into strips with my circular saw and Kreg rip cut, then trimmed them to length on the miter saw. I've detailed the cut list, dimensions, and diagrams in the printable plans linked in the video description. Most of the pieces of this project are fairly large, but I did rip 2 small pieces to about 2 inches wide to be almost like a partial face frame for this console. This may seem kind of odd, but it'll make more sense once you see it all come together. So let's take a quick break to discuss the design before we move on. This project is basically a box inside a box. Now in the video, I made the inside box first, then cut to fit the outside pieces to go around it. However, after building it, I highly recommend doing exactly the opposite. If I were to do this again, I would build the outside box first, then assemble the inside box to fit inside of it, and you'll see why a little later. Let's jump back into the build. So here I'm assembling the inside box. Once I had my top and bottom, back panel, 2 sides, 2 dividers, and face frame pieces cut to size, I sanded everything lightly before assembling. If I wasn't leaving these plywood edges exposed, this is also where I would apply edge banding as well. Just a side note, I'm not normally a fan of exposed edges, but for this project, I thought I'd give it a try, and for what it's worth, it easily cut the build time in half to skip the banding. So that's definitely something to consider. Once my pieces were sanded, I drilled pocket holes into the ends of the small face frame pieces and along the edges of the side panels. If there's any weeping and gnashing of teeth out there in opposition to the pocket holes, feel free to use your preferred method of assembly. None of these pocket holes will be visible in the finished project anyway, so unless you watch this video, you wouldn't even know they were there. People are always asking me about glue. You can certainly use glue here. I don't know that it's going to help a lot, but it's not going to hurt anything. It's just really messy. I don't use glue in a lot of my projects, and I know people criticize me for that, and that's fine, but the reason that I don't is because in a lot of cases, I take my projects apart later and reuse the wood. I'm constantly building things just to create content, so anything that I can recycle is great. So if I glue them, it's a lot harder to reuse the wood, take everything apart. If you want to use glue, go ahead. I'm not using glue, and that's why. At this point, I began assembling the box. Again, all the dimensions here can be found in the plans linked below. I attached the sides between the top and bottom with pocket holes and screws. Then I added the face frame pieces along the front to divide the 3 sections of the cabinet. For the divider panels, I just slid these in, checked that they were spaced properly and square, then screwed them in through the top and the bottom panels. Please forgive my blurry video. I forgot to wipe the sawdust off the lens and it was having issues auto-focusing. Sometimes when trying to build the things and film the things, you can't always do both or either very well. You'll notice that the side and the divider panels are all inset from the back edge, and that's because I added the back panel here to finish this up. I simply tapped this in and screwed it in place. And already, it's heavy, but I'm loving how this is coming together. The next part of the build was making the wraparound outside box. Now, I already mentioned that if I did this over, I would have made this first, then built the box that I just finished to fit inside of it. So this is a little out of order, but I think that you'll get the idea. I ripped another piece of plywood about 1.5 inches wider than I made my other box to make this box from. So I'm going to cut 45s on these corners for this piece that's going to like wrap around the main box. I want to do a continuous grain, so I've got it turned like upside down. So this bottom side is going to be the outside. This is going to be like the inside. So I need to cut short side first, then long top side, then the other short side. That way the grain will wrap around. Just so I can keep my brain straight here, the 45 needs to go this direction, then that direction. Then down here, it'll need to do the same. So it'll go that direction and that direction. I used a circular saw and a straight edge to cut my edges 45 degrees so that they would have a continuous grain around the sides and the top. This was a little tedious as I needed to make sure everything stayed perfectly square and that once assembled, this would fit around the inside box perfectly. Spoiler alert, it didn't, but we'll get there when we get there. I test fit the pieces and they seemed to be just right, so I proceeded to glue up these mitered corners. I used painter's tape on the joints to help hold them together and prevent the wood glue from making too big of a mess. Then I applied wood glue to the joints, folded them in, and clamped them with corner clamps until they were dry. While that was drying, I moved on to adding the legs. Now, if you've been around very long, these legs probably look pretty familiar. I used this exact same design on a few past dressers, a bench, Lucy's dog bed, Lucy's dog bowl stand, and a few other builds. So I pulled up the template on my website and drew out the same leg design, except I made it 8 inches tall. I cut these legs from solid walnut, but if you wanted to cut these from plywood as well, that would work fine. I cut this leg out with the jigsaw, then traced it on my board and cut out 3 more just like it and sanded them well. So for the legs, I'm not really sure where I wanted to place them, but I just kind of set them on here where I thought that they looked good. And I noticed that if I take my speed square and I put the pivot right here on the corner and I adjust it to 30, and then I set the front edge or the outside edge of the leg at about 4 inches on this side of the speed square. That looks pretty good, so I'm just gonna mark this for now. I used my speed square to lay out all 4 legs on the bottom side of the cabinet and marked where they went. Then I pre-drilled 2 holes inside these marks so that I could locate them from the inside of the cabinet. Then I held my leg in place and pre-drilled from the inside of the cabinet up through one of these holes and into the leg. Then I applied wood glue and drove a screw through the pre-drilled hole. Once this first screw was in, I could drive the other one from the inside of the cabinet and wipe away any excess glue. I repeated this for each leg and flipped it over to check how it was looking so far. Please look okay. It looks okay. Right. At this point, the glue was dry on the outside box, so I brought it back to the workbench and removed the clamps and the tape. Before cleaning up the corners, I thought it would be a good idea to just make sure it fit, and guess what? It didn't. So just to double check and make sure that the wraparound piece fit over the main body, I test fit everything before I cleaned up the corners. The inside opening of the wraparound piece is about 1/8 of an inch smaller than the main box. It's gonna be easier to just take this apart and trim this down than it is to rebuild that. This is why I recommend building the outside first, then building the inside to fit. It's much easier to modify the size of the inside box than the outside box. So I took it apart, trimmed the top, bottom, and back down 1/8 of an inch and reassembled it. Once it was back together, I tried this again. Thankfully, this time it fit and I could move on. I used a little wood glue and sawdust and careful sanding to clean up these mitered corners before adding this piece to the cabinet. Remember me telling you earlier about how I don't glue my stuff? This is a perfect example. I would recommend gluing this piece around the outside. However, because if in the future I want to take this apart, that's going to make it impossible. So I'm just going to screw this in place with screws from the inside. But if you were building this to keep forever and you never wanted to take it apart, I would definitely recommend just slathering the whole top and the sides with glue and then clamping this in place. I used a couple screws through the sides and top to connect these boxes, and the last pieces to add are the doors and the shelf. So typically with overlay doors on frameless cabinets, which is what this is, it's going to be full overlay, which means that it's going to cover most of the front edge here. However, I want to leave some of this front edge exposed. So I'm going to cut my doors so that it's just going to barely cover the top and the side. I'm going to bring it down to the bottom. I trimmed 2 plywood doors down to size. So I mentioned that I wanted my door to overhang the face frame here just barely. So with concealed hinges, they have adjustment options. So there's a lot of adjustment that I can make this direction just with the hinges alone. But in order to kind of get it as far out as possible, I'm going to install the hinges as close to this edge as possible. So I'm going to be using my Kreg concealed hinge jig to drill the concealed hinge holes. This also has an option here to adjust how far from the edge that you drill your hole. So I want to drill it as far this way as possible, and it shows millimeters. This is the distance from the edge of the door to the edge of the hole. So it basically just adjusts these stop blocks. So when you butt it up here to clamp it and drill it, it adjusts it further this way. It goes from 3 to 6 millimeters. So I'm going to adjust it to 3. So that would give me the smallest amount of space here as possible. Then I used my Kreg concealed hinge jig to drill hinge cup holes in these doors and installed concealed hinges for overlay doors on frameless cabinets. Then I attached these onto the cabinet and adjusted as needed to get my doors exactly where I wanted. I wanted to add a shelf in the middle section, so I used my Craig shelf pin jig to drill a few shelf pin holes in this opening. Now, because it's so small, I only drilled a few holes because there isn't a whole lot of room for adjusting. Then I cut a plywood shelf and installed it with shelf pins. It was a pretty tight fit. Everything was finished now, except for the finishing. I used walrus oil furniture butter to seal and finish this piece. It just kind of wipes on and leaves a smooth satin finish. I removed the doors to make it easier to get the inside, and once everything was oiled, I replaced the doors and the shelf and stepped back to admire this very mid-century style console. I love the dimension here, but I also love the simplicity. And the walnut plywood looks even better than I expected. I think this will definitely make the perfect TV stand or dining room console. I hope you enjoyed watching it come together, and if you want to build your own, the plans are linked in the video description. Thanks so much for watching, friends, and until next time, happy building!